Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures Weekly Chart Analysis for the week ending 14th of November 2025. The first chart is the US Dollar Index Futures. They closed slightly lower this week, trading in consolidation mode within the range of this up bar from 3 weeks back. Volume was reduced and below the average. There was no great sign of any intent to move higher this week, and selling pressure appeared quite low. This week's bar was lackluster trading, really, and you'll see that reflected in many of the other associated charts as we move forward. This is the E-mini S&P 500 index futures, and they closed sideways this week, right at this important level again. This is the breakout line from back here. Price did test for supply below the previous bar's close, attempted to move higher, drew out some supply, and you'll see that volume was once again above the average. So there is supply in this market, but there's sufficient buying support, there's sufficient demand to maintain price at the current level. Generally, when there is supply in the market, you'll see price test for supply in response, an attempt to remove that supply. I don't see this market accelerating higher sustainably while supply continues to be drawn out. This is US Treasury 10-year note futures, and they've traded back towards the lows of the range this week. Spread reduced. It was fairly narrow. Volume increased, but remained slightly below the average. This is reflecting the lackluster trading in the US dollar to some degree, and there was lackluster trading in this market as well. There was no great intent being shown. I won't be surprised to see the strength of this breakout line tested in the near future, but at this point, the last two bars have been on below average volume and haven't shown any great intent. Copper price futures. Copper price futures made an attempt to move higher this week, but did draw out some supply at the highs of the range here. Price continues to trade within the range of this widespread down bar on high volume. The market is slowly making some gains through here. There's a pressing nature towards the upside. There was no test for supply this week. Price attempted to push higher on increased and above average volume. Spread wasn't wide, so the market did encounter some supply, some selling pressure at the highs of the range, and that's forced a mid-bar close. I would expect a test for supply this week, something like this, at least early in the week, just to see how much supply is drawn out as price pulls back. Gold price futures. Gold price futures did encounter some supply this week as well. Price attempted to push higher in response to the test for supply last week. Price accelerated higher, encountered some supply, and moved back below the important level and closed just below that on increased and above average volume. So there was a pretty serious attempt to push higher, and that was hammered back down by supply that was drawn out. Once again, I'd expect a test for supply in response below the previous bar's close, at least early in the week, with a relatively narrow spread. We'll just see how much supply is drawn out. Supply is found to be low. There may be a secondary attempt to push higher. If supply is found to be high, you'll probably find a deeper test for supply. Silver price futures, similar to gold as you would expect. Price made a serious attempt to push higher in response to the test for supply last week. Price accelerated higher, encountered some supply, and closed about mid-bar, just below mid-bar. You've had 2 bars now, both which have encountered supply as prices attempted to move above that level there. I expect this market will test for supply, similar to the previous 2 markets, just below the previous bar's close, at least early in the week next week. And if supply is found to be low, there's likely to be an attempt to push higher later in the week. And if further supply continues to be drawn out, you may see price come back to this level and test it for strength. This is the energy sector, like crude price futures, and they're trading in consolidation mode following this strong up bar a month back. You can see the market's trading in consolidation mode. Price remains in between the 2 ranges. This is the high of the range below, the low of the range above. There was a reluctance to move lower through here, and then price recovered all that lost ground in 1 week, and now the market's trading in consolidation mode in response. Volume remains about the average. It's not low volume, but there's no serious supply being drawn out at this point in time. What selling pressure is present is comfortably being absorbed by the market. That leaves this market well placed to make an attempt to push higher when the supply really does ease back to low levels. Into the currencies now. This is the Euro-US dollar currency pair. Price just edged higher this week, trading the inverse of the US dollar, as you'd expect. Volume again was well below the average, so this was lackluster trading, and that probably reflects the fairly narrow spread. There was no great intent being shown. Price just floated higher on a lack of selling pressure, trading the inverse of the US dollar. Have a look at the pound. The pound moved higher as well, but only slightly. Pound's a little weaker than the euro again. This market traded below the previous bar's close, testing for supply for some period this week, and volume was right at the average. When you consider the euro didn't test for supply, it just pushed higher, but on low volume, below average volume. There's a bit more supply in this market. That's making it difficult for this market to move higher. Prices closed right at this level. The euro's pretty much just below that level up there. So this market's a little weaker than the euro at the moment. If you remember, this market was leading as price was pushing back up here. Japanese yen currency futures. They've almost certainly confirmed the breakdown this week. It was a weak attempt to recover last week, and prices just traded lower this week. It's not really broken down below this bar's low, but it's threatening to do so. It could recover from here and trade in this little zone if there was support found or if the US dollar was weak. But this market is threatening to break down, and it's not looking strong. It looks like the failure to recover last week was most likely confirmed this week, and that suggests this market will probably trend lower and confirm the breakdown. Aussie dollar currency futures, they traded higher as expected and up to this level, which we suggested last week. Price did make some attempt to move above it, but did encounter some supply similar to what it did here, and price pulled back to close in this comfortable range here where the market's not encountering too much supply, and what it does encounter is comfortably absorbed by the market, which is more important. So price has pretty much just moved up on slightly reduced but about average volume, so that's okay. There's no serious issues. I don't expect this market will have the strength to move higher here and break above this level unless there's real weakness in the US dollar, which I'm not expecting at this point. When the US dollar was moving lower this week, volumes were low, selling pressure was low, and that will allow the US dollar to float higher as soon as some increased demand emerges. This is Bitcoin futures. Bitcoin futures did fail this week and move lower. There was a brief attempt early in the week to move higher here, which failed dismally. Prices closed well below the previous bar's low and is pushing down towards the highs of this range down here, where I expect there will be some buying support found. I expect this market will move down to this level. It'll act like a magnet. The interesting thing is you would have expected this market to close right at this level this week. This is the logical level. And it didn't do so. It closed slightly above that level, which does leave some chance the market has overshot its lows and it may recover back to this level. But either way, that's the lows of this bar. But either way, weakness has emerged. There's no doubt. There's been a number of times now where the market really should have pushed higher up following this bar. And following this bar, there was an attempt there that failed. This bar was just holding on at that bar's lows. And this week, the price attempted to move higher and was knocked down again. Demand wasn't strong enough and supply overwhelmed it. Volume was increased, but just fractionally, and it remains about the average, just a fraction below the average. So that's genuine trading. There's no hidden trading in there. This market is looking for some buying support to emerge, and we'll see if it comes down and it emerges in this level in here, which is just between the 92 and 84 level. This is where the market found support previously through here. You would expect the market would find some buying support back at that level again if price continues lower. Just back to the US dollar index futures quickly. You can see that as prices come down over the last 2 weeks, volumes have reduced both weeks. Selling pressure is low. If selling pressure was a little higher, you may have seen price back to this level this week. It didn't do so. I would expect this market will attempt to move higher as soon as there's a bid in the market. It won't take much of a bid. It won't take much increased demand to move this market higher because selling pressure is low at the moment. If there's no bid in the market, I expect it will float lower again in a similar fashion to the last 2 weeks and trade like that. But I'm expecting a small amount of demand will emerge for whatever reason, and you'll see price attempt to move higher. If it's only weak, it'll only come up to this level. It may trade slightly above it and be pushed down to that level by the end of the week. But there's no selling pressure in this market, at least not at this point in time. There would have to be something emerge. There would have to be some catalyst emerge in the coming weeks for selling pressure to really build up. There's no selling pressure in this market. Okay, thanks for your time. Back again next week. See ya.